Help support this channel and get early access to videos plus exclusive content and patrons-only live discussions by becoming a member at patreon.com/Bruce Poinsette. This is the Bruce Poinsette Show, the world's most dangerous infomercial, and today we are talking local journalism, and specifically House Bill 2605, the Protect Local Journalism Act. I have Andrew Devigal from the University of Oregon Agora Journalism Center and Jody Lawrence-Turner for the Fund for Oregon Rural Journalism joining me today to talk about the bill, where specifically the funding goes to, and what are some of the obstacles, cough, Senate Republicans walking out, not doing their jobs, but also other things, cough, excuse me. So we have a good conversation, very actionable conversation. Again, the bill is in traffic now, but Andrew and Jody will tell you a little bit about what you can do to make sure local journalism throughout Oregon is supported. So check it out. Andrew, Jody, thank you for joining me this morning. How are you two doing today?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, we're good. We're good. Thanks for asking, Bruce, and thanks for inviting us to the show.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously journalism, and specifically supporting local journalism is, it's very important to me, part of this ecosystem. And I think we're going to be talking about HB 2605 today, the Protect Journalism Act. But before we get into the legislation specifically, if y'all just kind of talk about, like, there are a number of, I guess what I call like deficits as far as like the local journalism ecosystem. That makes sense. But I feel like a lot of people aren't engaged in sort of the behind the scenes of the media, so they don't understand what it means if there's no newspaper in this town, or what it means when we're cutting coverage of things like city councils, school boards, etc. And then there's also this discussion around, well, is it really a big deal if ChatGPT does all the journalism going forward? So I feel like
that sounds like a whole different conversation.
Yeah, that's a whole bigger one. But just to bring it back to, what sort of like, again, what are some of the deficits in local journalism coverage, and what does it mean to people?
Andrew, do you want to go first?
I was going to invite you to go first if you wish, Jody.
So I can tell you that we founded our nonprofit for this particular reason, that we were seeing news deserts starting to come up and the failure of newspapers throughout the state and throughout the country. So we immediately saw a need, and it was figuring out, how do we address this need? How do we try to help the news information system? And what we discovered was, unless news publications throughout the state, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit or all digital, or print and digital, they needed to work on their business model. So we thought that would be a good focus. But they also need an influx of staff support, and there are a lot of really small publications, especially in rural areas, that don't have the resources to hire someone for audience engagement, or hire someone to do better marketing for them, or access to technologies that are really advanced. And so we focused on that aspect of it. But we recognize that it takes a multi-pronged approach. So you need to be able to recruit journalists, because we're not getting as many young journalists coming in. So, we have a program that we started for that called Future Journalists of America. And we're seeing incredible results in diversity. And our graduates they're going to go study journalism. And so that's a need. That's one need. And then there's also a need for content. And that's on the, another end of it. So there's recruitment, business model, and content. And so what does it mean in these communities if they don't have a publication? It means potentially higher taxes. It could mean the city council run amok. It could mean less access to healthcare. It could mean the community feels disenfranchised and unconnected, and they get their information from a bias, unsubstantiated like websites, or they go towards what their beliefs are instead of looking at something that's factual. And that can be very dangerous. And we've seen that kind of evolve. And I don't know, I don't think this is a real big stretch, but the Greater Oregon movement, where they're trying to go, become part of Idaho. Well, the rural areas don't feel like their voices are being heard at the Capitol. And part of that is that there are so few publications on the east side of the state in those rural areas that are remote, and some of them are in frontier areas, even so hundreds of miles away from a highway or a freeway, I should say. They just don't feel like their voices are being heard, and so they feel like in Idaho they might be better heard, which is, that's scary. That's scary for Oregon, and that's just an example of what can happen when you don't have trusted community-based news sources. Your turn.
The one thing I'll thanks, Jody. The one thing I'll add is as some of your listeners might know, Bruce, as the director of the Agora Journalism Center, I wanted to share the fact that we actually released a report assessing Oregon's local news and information ecosystems in the fall of last year, and I'll share that link on the chat here, just in case you wanted to share that as a part of your show notes, Bruce. But in that report, we did take a snapshot of where things are in terms of local news and information ecosystems, and where news deserts are cropping up consistently throughout the state. And as Jody alluded to, when local news withers in a community, a lot of negative things come up, right? It increases. For example, the reliance on national news increases, while there's the decrease of coverage of local news and what matters locally. There's also an increase of political polarization, right? As Jody alluded to, that really, again, it decreases that community connection that's so key in trying to build and support communities to thrive. And then obviously there's also the opportunities for corruption at the sort of state and business level. One of my favorite quotes coming out of this was a colleague of mine from the Outlier Media in Detroit, Sarah Alvarez, where she said, information gaps are where misinformation breeds and accountability goes to die. So if there's a reminder of why it's so important to support local news and healthy information, I think these are the explanations of why we would need to support that, right? So I'm hoping that House Bill 2605 can contribute to that rebuilding, refocusing, re-earning the trust, but also build capacity at the local level for local news.
And I imagine there's also just regular a jobs implication there. I know newspapers are not the big factory or something where putting in thousands of jobs, but these are, hopefully, obviously, again, things are shrinking, but hopefully full-time jobs with benefits. And having those people, again, I imagine having people in your community, when you talk about trust in there, like actually covering these things is different than, like you said, you talk about people will then rely on national news. And even if it's, very credible, very well researched, it's still something different if it's someone in New York who's kind of like reading about the story and using, the sources that they can get access to, but still from across the country versus someone actually reporting on the scene, I imagine.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And when we talk about capacity building, that's what we're hoping to really gain, is really identify ways to put journalists and reporters on the ground, compensated properly, at a living wage, and really to support that and try to mitigate the amount of parachute journalism that does happen, especially at crisis moments, right? And as we know, we have lots and plenty of crises that we're dealing with here across the state, whether it's polarization, whether it's wildfires, whether it's water access, right? There's lots of things I think we need to consider as a community, as a state, to really bond us together.
I completely agree with that. I think that what we see is what we need to recognize is that the drought issues in, say, Pendleton are not the same as they are in, say, I don't know, Grants Pass. I mean, they can be there for every community. There's a different level of what they're dealing with. And it takes a local based, trusted news source in order to be able to identify that and put it in the appropriate voice. Otherwise, you do have that parachute journalism, like Andrew said, someone who comes in for a week or a day or two, and they try to do that story, and they may do a very good job, but they're not reflecting the accurate voices of those communities.
Yeah, and you also talked earlier about, helping with business models to actually like modernize for this time, which again is very tricky. But I just remember from my own experience working at a paper, where the eyeball is going, where is basically like how the money was being sort of that was kind of like the business model. And the things that get the clicks, especially when all these other things, as far as just like media literacy and engagement at a earlier level, are not really there. It's not usually going to be some of the stuff that, we might say is most pertinent or relevant to people, such as these decisions in your local city council, again, your school board. And that, again, often ends up shaping the coverage to where I think one of the things that was interesting to me, even in Portland, where you have a lot more also like community alternative papers, but where you'd see like very specific community papers and everything would be, wire stories, basically. And like, what does that mean? So let's talk about HB 2605 specifically, though. So what is this bill? What is in this bill? Where is the what would it be funding?
It is it's a partnership between Forge and Agora that develops a journalism resource center and studies the sustainability aspect of what's implemented, but also is going to go into, and I'll let Andrew talk more to his part of it, but they're going to have convenings to talk to communities, because engaging in communities is key to survival when it comes to journalism. If we don't ask the communities what they want, I mean, they're not going to read it, but if they're invested in it, that's just a much better way of doing it. I was going to pull up the narrative of the bill here, so I can tell you specifically. And I should have been prepared. Sorry.
No worries at all.
As Jody's doing that, let me just add some of the high level areas. So HB 2605, and as we've been framing it, is really to support local news, and it's an innovative bill. It's a $2.9 million infusion that would then support the Fund for Oregon Rural Journalism, or Forge, that Jody is the director of, and also the University of Oregon's Agora Journalism Center, which I'm the director of. And we've been able to find a budget and try to figure out a way to address 4 specific areas. As Jody alluded to, one is to launch and pilot a journalism resource center, which I know Jody will dive into it. And then it supports mini grants to support at least a dozen projects equally distributed across the state. And And in terms of Agora's perspective of really doing listening sessions also throughout the state to better understand potential interventions and also policy proposals that we would then present through the 2025 legislative session to really identify steps to help re-earn that trust of communities, and also really think of the capacity of information ecosystems across the state. And again, it's both local news and how we can communicate and share rich and trusted info. And then finally, obviously, all of this is going to be framed through our community informed work group that will basically serve as the firewall between public funding and direct reporting down on the ground. So that work group is, I think, a key component where we are going to try to include as many voices in that care about local news and information to really help shape what this might look like during this bill and also going forward.
Thanks, Andrew. Andrew captures it so well. So the Resource Center would fund, or the state funding would fund at least 10 reporters. It would fund the expansion of the Future Journalists of America program to Southern and Eastern Oregon. And it would have the mini grants for news publications. So by that, it's different than what Andrew was talking about. It's more like emergency funds to say, make sure they have a website and that kind of thing. So it would also support training for journalists, need assessments for news publications to kind of determine what it is that they need most. We did do a short survey in Oregon about what their needs are, and it's really interesting that majority of the news publications that responded are still relying on advertising to make their money. So I think increasing the digital reader revenue and the audience engagement component are critical to them moving forward with their business model. Then we would also fund a resource guide, which we would work with Agora on this. And it's because this resource guide is about what I've discovered as I've done different conferences and a bunch of different research, is that there's a lot of help out there, a lot of organizations willing to provide grants or support in other ways, and people don't find out about them. It doesn't trickle down to the really small organizations. And so this resource guide would be a searchable database where you'd be able to say, I have 2 people in my newsroom and we're looking for this kind of help, and it would give you a resource to go to. And then the audience engagement person that would work with multiple papers at once, tech support, grant writing assistance, and then community outreach and collaboration. And what that's about, and Andrew has studied this a lot more than I have, but I love the concept of a civic information hub, where you bring together people in the community from all ethnic groups, from health system, from the guy in town that everyone says they know, but you bring them all together to help inform what's happening in that community, and then that informs the journalism, so that people are getting a better reflection of their community, instead of just the people that sit in the newsroom and go to a meeting, or go to what they can to cover essential news, but this goes beyond that so that it expands their scope.
Yeah, I love that last part so much. I mean, all of it. But I just remember, again, just being in the newsroom, and even when you come in with the best intentions, just how the circumstances like shift, like who are your sources? It becomes, who is the most available, or who is, if I look at like police harassment, brutality, profiling issues, there is a specific police spokesman who is there all the time and ready to go to answer questions. So when you see these stories, that voice has an outsized influence. So when you talk about like a community or a civic engagement hub and actually like bringing in people that need to be heard and, you know, intentionally cultivating that. That's just what I think of as far as, again, actually shaping voices. Like, what does the actual community look like when we're doing this information, or when we're, you know, sharing these stories, when we're trying to get people's perspectives out there. Even another thing that's come up recently, you know, people have reached out to me about, it's just like the lack of coverage around the Jefferson High School redesign right now. And, you know, I think about something like this where, you know, it is a specific community story, but also this school and sort of community that has, especially with the Jefferson dancers, with, you know, some of the basketball and football programs, has a national profile. Like there's a lot of energy behind this, but it's not getting the coverage just because who's out there, or who do reporters in these newsrooms, like, if they're not plugged in to know who to talk to, because many people are from out of town, or from even just, you know, I can say this as someone who worked at a Portland newspaper but was from Lake Oswego. You know, there's just certain things I'm not going to know just by that circumstance. So,
Exactly.
yeah. So diversity is also another big part of this bill. Can you just talk about that component?
So part of how we are going to address it in the rural areas are those civic information hubs, as I mentioned. And we think that'll be a good way to start to bring in more diverse voices into the rural publications. So that's one way that we're going to do it. But then we're also going to work with more ethnic publications, even in metro areas, to make sure that we are amplifying their voices as well and getting them involved. And I will point out, and this is a bit of a boast, but the Future Journalists of America program that we started in Central Oregon is 25% diverse, which I'm very proud of. And there are young students that are being introduced to journalism who've always wanted to do it but didn't have the opportunity, and now they're seeing how it can be, you know, how it can happen.
Thank you, Jody. I also just want to add, you know, the chief sponsor of this bill, Representative Pham. I think it's she's been very clear from the top that you know, we really need to reach out to hard to reach communities and connect with them, and really, again, asking that question of information needs, right? How they get information, how they share information, and also some assets that they might have to be able to contribute to those community stories. So when I mentioned earlier about doing these listening sessions, we're also going to be collaborating with Oregon Values and Belief Center, where again we'll be creating mailers, post-its, doing listening sessions, and the intention there is also not just to, of course, connect with you know, as many hard to reach communities, whether it's rural, whether it's political, economic challenges, or even language barriers, right? We want to be able to make those both those listening sessions as well as those outreach with information needs assessments at multiple languages to reach to those oftentimes underserved and underheard and underrepresented communities.
Isn't the survey going to be distributed in multiple languages?
That's right. That's exactly right.
How many?
Well, we're looking. Last time I talked to Adam Davis from OVBC, I think we're going to try to hit as the top 6 languages recognized across the state.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I think that's also just an important part. One of the, you know, ongoing conversations I have with people is not just, well, especially from like youth journalism opportunities. And I've, you know, literally the thing that kind of like got me into the paper at U of O back down in Eugene was my editor, Tyree, who happened to be the first editor in chief of the Daily Emerald, or first Black editor in chief of the Daily Emerald down there. So I want to, you know, give him his props on that. But also, like, that came through Oregonian, I think, youth journalism program that has similar like focus as far as reaching out to diverse, what's the word, historically harder to reach communities. And then I think what was interesting just to notice, especially with a lot of people in that sort of student journalism space, was how many choose to stay in Oregon, not just for like primarily, not even for like journalism, as far as like the journalism industry itself, but just the opportunities in general, and then also what kind of supports there are again for non-white journalists in this state, and like what it means to be in these different newsrooms. So I think some of the stuff beyond just the job itself, and like actually again the intentionality behind that is so important.
That's right. And I'm also excited again when we're thinking about these grants to be able to get distributed around the state, so that support, especially around as we were talking about, like local networks of media makers, journalists, and we also need to also think about the diversity of where people are, right? So it's not just perhaps going beyond the newspapers, right? A lot of people are getting their news elsewhere, whether it's podcasts, whether it's radio, whether it's YouTube, right? There's other ways. So we need to really identify where people are getting their information and how do we bolster and make sure that those information is going where people are.
Absolutely. So all this sounds good, but there's the process of actually getting the bill passed. So one, can you just talk about, we're recording this on June 5th, just for reference for people watching later. So things, I know things are in flux and things may change, but what is the status of HB 2605 right now?
Well, it's still in the Ways and Means committee, and we are waiting for the results of that. As we know, not everyone is in session, or at least participating in the session. So we urge the lawmakers to return to session and try to get some important bills and legislation passed so that it really serves Oregonian across the state, right? So I think right now we're really in a wait and see moment. We are hoping within a week or so that we would hear the results if HB 2605 has been passed and fully funded. And if we are, while we're waiting, I would hope that you listeners might go to a couple of the links that we will share in the show notes to encourage folks to both sign in, both as the sign-in letter, but also a way to communicate to their local legislators to again participate, support, and really fund this bill going forward, especially as we think about the health of local news and really trusted civic information that's crucial to all of our communities, to all Oregonians.
So I'll share the Forge website with you, and that has a link to a letter. And then Andrew has a link that their government relations person created that helps. It sends an email directly to the legislatures on the Ways and Means Committee, right, Andrew? You're on mute.
Thanks for that catch, Jody. Yeah, I'm going to share that link. I can't find it right away right now, but that could be definitely something I'll share with Bruce to include the overarching landing page around the bill. We do use a bit.ly link called bit.ly. If you go to bit.ly/OHB 2605, and that would be the sort of our landing page for the whole bill itself. So that definitely is an opportunity to get a little bit more background. The current link to sign that letter, though, unfortunately, is not the current one. So I will provide that link shortly with you, Bruce.
Okay. And yeah, for listeners, again, all these links will be in the show notes, in the description. So okay, you will know where to go. But I think often with these things where, there's a call to action around this, sometimes people, they can be, I'm not going to say like intimidated by the minutia. It's a weird way to phrase it, but, there's that understanding of like, is it really that simple of me, signing this letter, reaching out to my politician? This is just a level of, cynicism and fatigue a lot of people have. But I also think it's important to understand, you mentioned the walkouts earlier, specifically for those, again, who may not be aware, had a contingent of Senate Republicans in the Oregon legislature who have just been walking out on duty. I've lost count of how many days now, but basically the objective is to stop bills from getting passed. And this this is very much affected by that. But yeah, can you just talk a little bit? I know we talked a little bit offline beforehand about just like some of the complicatedness of some of these obstacles, but you're even talking about like how the bill is classified could be something that's kind of just like, uh yeah, just, yeah, it's just an obstacle, I guess. But can you just talk a little bit about kind of like, with all these like little things that happen just in the political process, why these things, like why a petition, why emailing your representative, sending a letter to your representative, reaching out like this is so important for people?
I think, okay, so a couple of things to capture. This bill has 18 sponsors, which is incredible. That's great. The downside is none of them are Republican at this point. However, we've been working on trying to get more Republicans to sign on to this particular bill. And we have spoken with Tim Knope, and he is willing to send a letter over to prioritize this particular bill. In terms of the complications, I have never really lived in the politics world. And so this has been a steep learning curve, I think, for several of us. So first we all testified, Agora and Agora Journalism Center, Andrew and Regina and I, we testified at the hearing for the Rules Committee. And then they had to add an amendment and go and get it to be moved on to the Ways and Means, and the Rules Committee moved it over. And so since then, we've been waiting for it to go to a subcommittee. And maybe this is more in the weeds than you want, but then we've heard from Representative Pham, who's the lead person on this, that there are a number of ways that this could end up getting funded because it's such a small amount. And while it's small to the state government, it's huge in journalism. So I think the reason that sending the email, signing the petition, doing all of that matters is because these are those legislatures' constituents. And if they know that journalism matters to the people that they serve, I think that they're going to be more willing to pass this bill, whether it's rolled into a particular budget or it's passed on its own.
Okay, yeah. I mean, again, I think that just kind of like gets to the point, or the larger point anyway, about the power of public sentiment and pressure specifically, because I said, even if you kind of like get lost in some like the details of the minutia, ultimately, what's going to push that through, or what's going to make sure it doesn't get lost, right? So yeah, Andrew, Jody, thank you again for taking the time this morning. Just one more time for people, again, if they want to learn more, they want to get involved, we're going to have the links in the show notes, but you just tell them, what can people do if they want to get more involved and support HB 2605?
Talk to as many legislatures as you can. Send, especially the Ways and Means Committee, if you're going to look for a target and to be most efficient, send it to message to every legislature on the Ways and Means Committee.
And I'd also add, just reach out to others, your other people in your network, other Oregonians, your friends, your family that really rely on trusted civic information and local news to really kind of bring our communities together, right? So encourage them to also write, to learn more about this bill, and to ask their legislators to support this and fully fund this bill going forward. Again, the idea is to really spend the resources to be able to identify more meaningful policy proposals going forward, again in the future session, that really kind of puts us groundwork. And there's other opportunities in other states, Washington State, California, New Jersey, Colorado. They're doing various kinds of these kinds of public policy, public funding work, and I think it's a model to learn from, as the issue of local news and the growing news deserts is not just happening here across the state. It's happening in almost every community across our nation. So I think it's critical, as you noted when you first started, Bruce, with the demise of the trust in local news, the impending advent of AI generated content that's also going to add to the cluster of misinformation out there. I think we need to get ahead of this to really make sure that what we're delivering and journalists is delivering is trusted, is something that we can rely on to really address both emergency related crises, or actually just building our communities and connecting with each other across all of our communities here in Oregon.
Indeed. Well, Andrew Devigal, University of Oregon, Agora Journalism Center, Jody Lawrence Turner Fund for Oregon Rural Journalism. Thank you again for taking the time today, and hopefully this bill can get pushed through. Again, there's issue of certain legislatures who like to be on the job, so we can get this done, but we shall see. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you.
Appreciate you having us, Bruce. Thank you so much.